You think you know this man, the philosopher king, the perfect Stoic who wrote Meditations. You've been lied to. The book you think is a guide to a tranquil life was actually a survival manual written in the heart of an apocalypse. The man you see as a marble statue was a drug-dependent emperor ruling a dying world who spent his nights writing notes to himself just to keep from going insane. This isn't the story of a philosopher. This is the story of a man who endured hell on earth and the dark secrets he took to his grave. Before the darkness, there was the dream. Rome in the mid-2nd century was the unquestioned master of the world. It was the era of the 5 good emperors, a supposed golden age of peace and prosperity. Marcus Aurelius was never meant to be the sole emperor. He was a scholar, a quiet man who preferred books to battlefields. He was groomed for a life of quiet contemplation, co-ruling with his adopted brother Lucius Verus. The system was designed to be stable, to be perfect. The empire felt eternal, untouchable. But empires are fragile things, and just beyond the horizon, 2 storms were gathering that would not just break the peace, they would shatter the very soul of Rome. If you find this hidden history fascinating, make sure you're subscribed because we're just getting started. The first crack appeared in the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient rival, invaded Armenia, a Roman client state. It was a direct challenge that could not be ignored. Marcus, the philosopher, remained in Rome to govern, while his co-emperor, the more martial Lucius Verus, was sent to lead the legions. On the surface, it was a stunning Roman victory. The general, Avidius Cassius, a brilliant and ruthless commander, smashed the Parthian armies. He sacked their capital, Ctesiphon, and burned it to the ground. The triumphal parades in Rome were magnificent. Triumphal arches were built. It looked like another glorious chapter for the empire. But the returning soldiers brought something back with them, something far more deadly than any Parthian spear. They brought back a passenger, an invisible enemy that would feast on the empire from within. It started quietly, a cough here, a fever there. The physicians of Rome had never seen anything like it. They called it the Antonine Plague, but it was likely a virulent strain of smallpox. It arrived in the port of Ostia with the triumphant legions and spread through the city's veins like poison. At first, it was dismissed. Romans were used to disease, but this was different. The symptoms were horrifying. A raging fever, vomiting, a throat so swollen the victim would suffocate. And then came the pustules, black and foul-smelling, covering the body inside and out. For those who survived the initial onslaught, the ordeal was far from over. Many were left blinded, their hands and feet turning black with gangrene before falling off. This wasn't a disease, it was a monster. The city turned into a morgue. At its peak, the plague claimed 2,000 lives in Rome alone. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through it, wrote of the terror. The air was thick with the stench of death. The constant wailing of mourners became the city's soundtrack. There was no room to bury the dead. They were thrown into the Tiber, stacked in alleyways, or sealed inside their own homes. The social fabric disintegrated. People abandoned their sick relatives, terrified of contagion. The economy ground to a halt. Fields lay fallow. Workshops fell silent. The Roman state, this monolithic symbol of order, was helpless. It could conquer armies of men, but it couldn't fight a microscopic killer. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who wrote about accepting fate, was now the emperor presiding over the end of the world. How does a man shoulder this burden? Marcus was not a physically strong man. He suffered from chronic chest and stomach pains, insomnia, and constant stress. to function, to simply get out of bed and rule a collapsing empire, he relied on his doctor, the famous Galen. And Galen's primary prescription was a potent concoction called theriac. On the surface, it was a complex herbal remedy, but its key active ingredient was opium. Marcus Aurelius, the paragon of Stoic self-control, was a functional opium addict. He took a dose every single day. It dulled his physical pain, yes, but it also dulled the crushing psychological weight of watching his world die. Every calm, rational sentence you read in Meditations was likely written under the influence of a powerful narcotic. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a tool for survival. Meditations was never meant for you to read. It was his private journal, his to himself. It's not a collection of abstract philosophical musings, it's a desperate conversation with himself. When he writes, "Accept the things to which fate binds you," he's not talking about being late for a meeting. He's talking about watching a quarter of his empire's population die from a hideous disease. When he writes about controlling his anger, he's talking about the rage he feels towards incompetent officials or the sheer futility of his situation. He's reminding himself not to despair, not to give in to the horror that surrounds him. It's the raw, unfiltered record of a man trying to keep his own mind from shattering while the world burns down around him. He wasn't teaching philosophy, he was performing emergency psychological first aid on himself, night after night. As if the plague wasn't enough, a second storm broke, this time in the north. Seeing the empire weakened, ravaged by disease, the Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier saw their chance. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, and a dozen other tribes surged across the border in a massive invasion. This wasn't a simple raid, this was a full-scale war of annihilation. They burned Roman towns, slaughtered garrisons, and for the first time in centuries, a barbarian army crossed the Alps and laid siege to a city in Italy itself, Aquileia. The panic in Rome was absolute. The state was bankrupt from the plague, the army was hollowed out by sickness, there was no money, and there were no men. This was an existential threat. The philosopher had to become a warlord. Marcus took desperate measures. He sold off the imperial family's own jewels, furniture, and priceless artworks in a public auction that lasted 2 months just to fund the war. He conscripted slaves, gladiators, and even criminals into the army to fill the ranks of the dead legionaries. He, the man who hated war, then spent the better part of the next decade of his life not in a palace in Rome, but in a freezing, muddy campaign tent on the banks of the Danube. This is where most of Meditations was written, not in a quiet study, but in the heart of a brutal, grinding war zone surrounded by death and violence. He fought 2 entire wars, known as the Marcomannic Wars, pushing the tribes back inch by bloody inch. It was a relentless, exhausting struggle that consumed his health and the empire's last resources. The war was filled with moments of sheer desperation. The most famous is the Miracle of the Rain. The Legio 12 Fulminata, the Thundering Legion, was completely surrounded by the Quadi tribe. They were trapped in a waterless valley, dying of heat and thirst, about to be wiped out. According to Cassius Dio, just as the barbarians were closing in for the kill, the sky suddenly turned black. A torrential downpour erupted, but only over the Roman lines, reviving the exhausted soldiers. At the same time, lightning and hail crashed down upon the Quadi, throwing them into chaos. The revived Romans launched a furious counterattack and routed the enemy. Was it divine intervention, an Egyptian mage's spell, a freak weather event? We don't know. But for Marcus and his men, it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, they could still win this unwinnable war. Just when it seemed Marcus was finally turning the tide against the Germans, he was stabbed in the back. The blow came from the one man he trusted to hold the East, Avidius Cassius, the hero of the Parthian War, the governor of Syria, one of the most powerful men in the empire. A rumor, possibly started by Marcus's own wife Faustina, spread through the eastern provinces. Marcus Aurelius was dead. Seizing the moment, Cassius declared himself emperor. He controlled Egypt, Rome's breadbasket, and the powerful legions of the East. For Marcus, this was a devastating blow. It wasn't just a political crisis, it was a profound personal betrayal. While he was freezing on the Danube, fighting for Rome's survival, his most celebrated general was trying to steal his throne. A civil war would have been the final nail in the empire's coffin. The legions would have turned on each other, while the barbarians poured across the undefended frontiers. But here, we see the philosopher in action. His response was not rage, but sorrow. He addressed his troops, who were baying for Cassius's blood, and he lamented not that he had an enemy, but that he had lost a friend. He promised that if it came to a fight, he would show mercy. He forbade his senators from carrying out harsh purges against Cassius's family and supporters. He didn't want a cycle of revenge. In one of the most remarkable moments in Roman history, he actively sought to prevent the bloodshed that always accompanied a usurpation. He was more concerned with healing the empire than with punishing his rival. The civil war never happened. Once the Eastern legions learned that Marcus was in fact still alive, support for Cassius evaporated. They had no desire to fight the beloved and respected emperor. After just 3 months and 6 days as a supposed emperor, Avidius Cassius was assassinated by one of his own centurions. His head was cut off and sent to Marcus on the Danube. But Marcus refused to see it. He was disgusted by the act and ordered the head to be buried. He then traveled to the east, not to punish, but to pardon. He burned all of Cassius's correspondence without reading it, so he would never know who else was involved in the plot. He showed clemency to Cassius's children. It was an act of incredible statesmanship and mercy, but it came at a cost. The whole affair had delayed the final victory on the Danube and further exhausted the emperor. Marcus had faced plague, war, and betrayal. But his greatest failure, the one that would undo all his work, was in his own home. His son, Commodus. After a century of adopting the best man for the job, Marcus made the fateful decision to let his biological son succeed him. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. Commodus was everything Marcus was not. He was vain, selfish, cruel, and had no interest in philosophy, governance, or military duty. His only passions were the gladiatorial games and indulging his own decadent whims. Marcus must have seen the darkness in his son. He brought him to the frontier, made him co-emperor, and tried to teach him the duties of a ruler. But it was no use. The boy who would inherit the world was a monster in the making. Why did Marcus choose him? Was it parental love, a blind spot, or was it pressure from his wife and the Roman elite to secure a blood succession? We can only speculate, but the signs were there. While Marcus was negotiating treaties and planning campaigns, Commodus was more interested in his own glorification. He saw the grim duty of the frontier not as a responsibility, but as an annoyance keeping him from the pleasures of Rome. The historian Herodian wrote that from his earliest boyhood, Commodus was dishonest and dishonorable. It's the ultimate tragedy of Marcus's life. The man who worked so hard to save the Roman world from external threats was about to hand it over to a tyrant from within his own family. All his sacrifice, all the suffering, was about to be squandered. In the year 180 AD, after nearly 2 decades of constant crisis, the emperor's body finally gave out. He likely died from the plague, which had returned for a second wave. His death was not that of a peaceful philosopher in a sunlit villa. It was the death of a tired soldier, far from home, in a cold, damp fort on the edge of civilization. His final days were spent not in quiet reflection, but in a desperate attempt to implore his friends to guide his wayward son. He begged them to be fathers to Commodus, to steer him away from his vices. He knew what was coming. His last recorded words were a quote from a tragedy. "Why do you weep for me, when you should be thinking of the pestilence and of the death that is the common lot of us all?" Even at the end, he was trying to manage the grief of others. The moment Marcus was dead, Commodus abandoned everything his father had fought for. He made a quick, humiliating peace with the Germanic tribes, giving up hard-won Roman territory. His father's life's work, the security of the northern frontier, was thrown away in a matter of weeks. His only goal was to get back to Rome and indulge himself. The death of Marcus Aurelius wasn't just the death of an emperor. The historian Cassius Dio famously wrote that it marked the point when the Roman Empire descended from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The age of the 5 good emperors was over. The long, slow decline of the Roman Empire had begun, and the fuse was lit by Marcus's own son. Commodus's reign was a spectacle of insanity. He neglected the state, handing over power to corrupt favorites while he pursued his obsession with the arena. He fought as a gladiator hundreds of times, killing exotic animals and fighting hapless opponents in fixed matches. It was an embarrassment to the Roman elite. He saw himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. He demanded the Senate declare him a living god. His paranoia grew, and he unleashed a reign of terror, executing senators and anyone he suspected of plotting against him. The order and discipline Marcus had bled to maintain dissolved into a circus of corruption and fear. The empire was now led by the very type of tyrant Marcus had warned against in his own writings. While Commodus played gladiator, the empire rotted. The peace he had made on the Danube fell apart. The treasury, which Marcus had painstakingly refilled, was emptied to pay for his lavish games and personal luxuries. He devalued the currency, sparking inflation that would cripple the economy for generations. His misrule led directly to a period of intense instability. After his eventual assassination, strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner, the empire plunged into a brutal civil war known as the Year of the 5 Emperors. The stability Marcus had died to preserve was gone. The chaos he had held at bay for 20 years had finally broken through the gates. So, we come back to the Stoic lie. The lie isn't that Marcus Aurelius was a bad man or that Stoicism is useless. The lie is the image of perfection. The lie is that philosophy alone can make a man immune to suffering. It can't. The story of Marcus Aurelius is far more powerful when you remove the marble pedestal. This was not a god dispensing wisdom from on high. This was a mortal man, plagued by illness, addicted to painkillers, betrayed by his friends and failed by his own son, who got up every single day and faced an apocalypse. He led armies when he wanted to read. He managed a plague that would break a lesser man. He held a crumbling world together through sheer, stubborn force of will. Meditations is not a book about how to be happy. It's a book about how to do your job when you're in hell. It's a testament to human endurance. It shows that strength isn't the absence of pain or fear.
Strength is functioning in spite of it. The quotes aren't platitudes, they are weapons he forged in the fire of his own experience to fight off despair. The real lesson of Marcus Aurelius is not to seek a life without obstacles. The real lesson is that you will be faced with plague, war, betrayal, and disappointment. The question is, how will you respond? Will you crumble, or will you, like him, write your own guide to survival, one painful day at a time? What part of his hidden story surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.